Hi guys. First of all, I would like to wish you all an excellent year 2014. I wish it brings you everything you hope for, and maybe even more. Life can be full of surprises, and sometimes they are excellent. Never forget that. But for today, I would like you to relax and follow me on this second video about the French Revolution. It doesn't matter too much if you did not watch the first video, because I mainly talked about the various interpretations, the various readings of the revolution in this first episode, and now we're going to start talking about the events themselves. But as a starter, we have to talk about the context, because you can easily imagine that revolutions do not appear in peaceful and prosperous countries. There was a collection of reasons behind the events that started in 1789. And maybe the most, or the deepest, the most underlying reason was a high degree of dissent about the social order of France. This came from the transformations of the French society in the 18th century. If you saw the first video, you remember that I talked about the emergence in the 18th century of the bourgeoisie in the French society. The bourgeoisie was the fraction of the population that got wealthier as the century advanced, thanks to its involvement in industries, in banking, in trade, and in the wake of a high bourgeoisie that was sometimes extremely wealthy, also appeared like a middle class of people that were educated, that worked for the bourgeoisie sometimes, lawyers, for example, teachers, and in the rural parts of France too, wealthy peasants that sometimes had enough land and enough assets to allow their children to get an education. But the structure of the French society, like in the majority of European countries at this time, was still based on old structures, and especially the ones that were inherited from feudal times. The social order was based on a very strict hierarchy of rights and freedoms, depending on the social group you belong to. People that belonged to the nobility and the clergy could benefit from privileges that were acknowledged and official, meaning that they had a number of rights that others did not have, that they paid less taxes, and this was supposed to be a retribution for their contribution to the society, inherited from the Middle Age in particular. The nobility, for example, did not have to pay taxes because they paid what people called the price of blood. They were here to defend their vassals and their peasants. The clergy also was privileged for the social role it occupied, helping the poor, for example. But the problem is that the evolution of the society made that the legitimacy of these privileges had partly disappeared. The nobility was not anymore like in the Middle Age the social group that risked its life to defend the population. The clergy sometimes had forgotten its vows of poverty and had accumulated extremely impressive properties, so that the part of the third estate, the rest of the population, but more specifically this rising middle class and bourgeoisie, was increasingly inclined to contest this social order, all the more that the laws, the taxations, were extremely different from one part to another of the kingdom due to its progressive extension over time, which was making it difficult to develop their business in the country. However, tensions were not only due to the contesting of privileges, there were also tensions within each of these classes or each of these orders. The third estate represented more than 95% of the population, out of which a majority was peasantry, and very often people living in a state of poverty, sometimes in misery, and they had a totally different view and style of living than the middle class and the bourgeoisie. Within the nobility, some families were very prestigious and still wealthy and influent, but some others were relatively poor. They had had to sell their lands in order to maintain their standards of living, and they lacked financial resources without having the right to work as nobles. And within the clergy, you had extremely different situations too, with a part of the clergy living close to the people in poverty, and on the other hand, bishops and cardinals that were at the same time living in luxury and politically influent. In the years before the revolution, there was a tension, in particular in the nobility, with a part of this class trying to enforce or to restore old privileges that had become obsolete and were not applied anymore, in order to try and find new financial resources which increased, exacerbated the tensions. The 18th century too had seen the diffusion in this newly educated class of the bourgeoisie and middle class of new ideas coming from various philosophers. For example, names like Voltaire, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, like a group of philosophers called the encyclopedists, who were writing one of the first encyclopedies in the world, including also foreign philosophers or thinkers like John Locke, for example. And even though these philosophers had very different views from one to another, they fed the contestation on this social order on the basis that it was irrational and not justified by the state of the society. So you had a quite high level of discontent with the social structure. But there was more than that, and in particular a very acute financial crisis in terms of public finances. The budget of the state was structurally in deficit. To give you a few figures, the annual income was about 500 million pounds. The pound, or the livre, was the currency of the kingdom in the 18th century, and the spendings were a bit more than 600 million pounds. This meant that this accumulation of deficits had created a huge public debt that the state was struggling to reimburse. And in the years 1770s, this problem of the debt reached a higher level with the engagement of France in the War of Independence of the United States. If you saw the video I made about Louisiana, Quebec, and the history of New France, you remember that I talked about the 7 Years' War in the middle of the 18th century that had seen France losing to Britain its possessions in North America, so that there was a lot of anger and willing to revenge against the United Kingdom. When the American Revolution started, the public in Paris was particularly interested in what was going on in America. First, because the newly born United States had made a bit of lobbying in influential groups of the Parisian society. Second, because this revolt in the United States looked like a live experiment on ideas about the balance of powers and the organization of a society that philosophers had been writing about in the course of the century. And third, very importantly, because seeing the British in trouble was not unpleasant for the French public, so that there was a natural sympathy for this revolt in the British colonies, and starting in 1776, France started to help the insurgents, and 2 years later, in 78, entered officially the war against Britain on the American side. This war lasted until the Treaty of Paris in 1783, in which the United Kingdom recognized the independence of the United States. It was a victory to which France had contributed, so that it had restored its prestige, but financially the cost of this war had been enormous. It had represented about £1 billion, that amounted to 2 years of spending of the budget, and all of that had been financed by additional debt. So that by the end of the 1780s, the situation when it came to public finance was completely disastrous, and France seemed to be on the verge of bankruptcy as new creditors became almost impossible to find. The reasons behind this upcoming bankruptcy are not only the war, they also reflect the deep imbalances and impossibility to reform the French society and fiscal system. There had been attempts in the 1780s to make the two wealthiest orders of the society, the clergy and the nobility, to pay more taxes, but because the monarchy was internally weakened, it was unable to impose a taxation, and every time there was an attempt of that kind, the nobility managed to avoid it. Another big problem when it came to public finance was that the debt was so huge that the service of the debt, the payment of interest, represented almost half of the total spending, leaving no flexibility in terms of the management of the budget. And even more deeply, another structural problem is that in order to quickly find cash, the state in France had become used to sell the rights to receive taxes against an important amount. This had started decades before. The state sold rights to a person or to investors, sometimes members of the bourgeoisie in particular, that paid an amount, and the counterpart was the right to perceive a particular tax in a region or in the whole kingdom. Even though this permitted to quickly find capital and continue with the budget, this undermined strongly the level of income of the state in the long run, and made it impossible to increase taxes even higher. And on the top of that, by the end of the 1780s, started a period of bad harvests, meaning that food was scarce, and some regions of France were suffering from a lack of food that obviously hit the most the poorest parts of the population. So that by the end of the 1780s, the situation looked a bit disastrous. You had this high level of social tensions and contesting of the social order, fueled or fed by ideas that were attacking the very structures of the society. You had a severe financial crisis that seemed to make a bankruptcy inevitable, and on the top of that, people were hungry. Despite all of this, the royal institution was still fairly well respected. That would change in the following years, but in 1789, even though there was a high level of dissent and worries in the kingdom, the image, the figure of the king remained a very respected one, because France had been a kingdom for more than a millennium, and no other kind of regime looked even thinkable. Actually, the opponents, especially the ones coming from the Third Estate, were only looking for reforms, for modifications in the social order, but not something so radical. A solution had to be found to try and exit this crisis, and the solution, or the attempt to find a solution, would come under the form of the Convocation of the Estates General. The Estates General were an assembly of representatives of the various orders that structured the society. It had been created about 5 centuries before the 18th century, at the beginning of the 14th century in the Middle Age, and in the 14th and 15th centuries, this assembly, made of representatives of the nobility, the clergy, and the Third Estate, had been called several times by the successive kings when they needed approval from their people for new extraordinary taxes, for particularly important decisions. But in the 17th century, the rise of absolute monarchy in France, the transition from a regime in which the power of the king was checked by the nobility in particular, to a much more centralized and absolute power of the monarchy. This took place in particular under the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King, starting by the middle of the 17th century, meant that the Estates General had become obsolete, and when they were called in 1789, it was the first time since a century and a half that the Estates General were gathered. So this was politically a very significant decision to restore this assembly, and also an acknowledgement from the king, Louis XVI, that its power had been weakened in comparison with his ancestors, and that he now needed to find solutions and legitimacy by gathering the Estates General. For these reasons, the convocation of the Estates General raised a lot of hope in the population, and especially the Third Estate, that reforms would now be possible, that they would have their say in the social structure of the kingdom, and that these privileges, these differences in the law that made it impossible to reform the various regions of the kingdom, and also for them to expand their trade or their business, all of that could be maybe solved. But immediately the preparation of the Estates General made appear a number of oppositions and problems, especially since traditionally each order had one vote in the Estates General, so that the nobility and the clergy, representing 3–4% of the population together, could easily impose their views to the Third Estate. And in order to try and avoid this, the representatives of the Third Estate asked to have twice as much representatives as the other orders, hoping that votes would be personal and not by order, which would have given the same weight to the Third Estate than the one that the clergy and the nobility together had. Apparently, this right was given to them because they had more representatives than the other two orders, but when the session of the Estates General opened in May 1789, the king and his ministers made a number of errors, of faux pas, that would lead to very surprising consequences. The first error was to receive the representatives of the nobility and the clergy with honors and many signs of respect, whereas the representatives of the Third Estate were ignored. Not very smart, because it immediately meant that the representatives of the Third Estate became a bit defiant. A second mistake or disappointment for the Third Estate would be that when the Estates General started, it appeared that apparently the vote by order would be maintained, giving no equality between the Third Estate and the two other orders, which infuriated the Third Estate. And finally, the Third Estate was also disappointed when the king and his ministers, the Minister of Finance in particular, presented the questions or the works that the Estates General were supposed to achieve, because the financial problem was the only question raised to the attention of the Estates General. There was no intention, apparently, to discuss all the reforms, all the requests that the Third Estate had in mind and had accumulated during the preparation of the Estates General. So the first weeks of the Estates General were extremely disappointing and unproductive until mid-June 1789. Several weeks were lost talking and arguing about how the Estates General would function and what they would talk about. And this is the moment when Louis XVI made another terrible mistake in an attempt to find a solution to this dead end in which the Estates General were entering. He ordered one day to lock the room where the Third Estate was supposed to meet and where the representatives of the Third Estate were supposed to discuss. This infuriated again the representatives of the Third Estate, and they went to another room, the tennis court. It was a sport room near the castle of Versailles, where the Estates General were taking place. And this group of representatives of the Third Estate, together with a few representatives of the nobility and the clergy, decided to name itself the National Assembly of the French people, rejecting the authority of the king on the Estates General and self-transforming itself in an assembly that represented the people of France, excluding the rest of the representatives of the nobility and the clergy. This group also made a promise, an oath called the Tennis Court Oath, on the 20th of June 1789, claiming that they would give a constitution to France and would not split before this constitution is written. We have to understand that this was a direct attack on the royal institution as it was working. I told you that the type of monarchy that France had had since the 17th century was an absolute monarchy, a system in which all power was coming from the king himself, and he had a say on every aspect of power, be it executive, legislative, judiciary. By saying that they would make a constitution, these people from the Third Estate were actually saying that power was not coming from the king, but from the people, and they were also saying that a constitution would limit the king's power, which was hard to accept, of course, for the royal institution and the aristocracy. Initially, there was no reaction of the king, but after a few days he ordered that troops would march towards Paris and Versailles. The two cities are relatively close. First, because he probably wanted to impress these representatives and try and put an asset in his game to negotiate with them, but also because the situation in Paris in June and the beginning of July 1789 was fastly deteriorating. First, because the food continued to be scarce and the price of bread in Paris had doubled in a few months, making it very difficult for the working class to survive. Second, because the bourgeoisie in Paris was increasingly worried and disappointed by the absence of reforms and results from the Estates General. But this maneuver proved fairly clumsy, because the population in Paris, instead of keeping quiet, started to be more and more excited, and various revolts appeared here and there in the first days of the month of July that were replaced. But this would take a totally different dimension on the 14th of July, when, and I'll talk about that in the next video, the people of Paris would march towards the Bastille. Okay guys, that will be all for today. I have a quite good cliffhanger with my story of the Bastille, so we will continue the story in the next episode. See you soon, bye bye.